Hello, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We are just going to give folks 1 to 2 minutes to jump in before we get started. Okay, and then before we do get started and jumping into introductions, I will be launching a poll for the attendees, get some interesting responses on this one and get some thoughts starting to bubble up. So give me 1 second while that poll pulls up. Super interested in everyone's thoughts here. I know just with the audience and the panel today, we've got both law firm and in-house attendees, which is always great. So we want to get a good sense from both about what they're seeing and what they're actually interacting with there. Okay, so I am now going to close the poll and show everybody the results. Would be interested to hear which bias leaning the audience is for today. I'm with the firm. AFAs are okay. All right. I'm with in-house. Okay, it's 2020. AFA, we love AFAs and AFAs are okay. Not too many saying AFAs are painful. Actually less on the law firm side than the client side, which is super interesting. A lot more clients thinking AFA is painful. Where hopefully today, we have this Ask Me Anything panel style, and the information and the insights and our guests will be able to provide some additional color to some of the things that you guys are feeling and experiences on a day-to-day basis. So with that, I am going to start the webinar. My name is Maui Gevero. I am the Senior Manager of Legal Advisory here at PERSUIT. And today's webinar is really about innovative pricing in legal. And how this all started and came together was, as you may or may not know, we publish an annual report called the PERSUIT 50, which are essentially the most trusted firms on PERSUIT. And this is based off of all of the firms that our clients have engaged over the past year, which really includes, over $1 billion of work awarded by these companies to these firms on the platform. The report features several different categories, and one of them in particular is really about that innovative pricing. Which firms are leveraging it the most often and engaging with their clients on an innovative pricing basis outside of the traditional hourly rate. So all of our panelists today are coming from firms that are featured on that PERSUIT 50 trusted firms. And really, this is a measurement of how much the clients trust them in terms of awarding them with work and how willing they are to collaborate and innovate with the clients that we have. So with that, I'm going to start introducing our panelists for today, and we are going to start with Ron Chapman. So Ron is a shareholder at Ogletree Deakins, an international employment law firm with 55 offices and over 900 labor and employment lawyers. He serves on the firm's board of directors and previously chaired its innovation council. The international law offices have named Ron as the overall winner for the entire United States in the employment and labor category for its Client Choice Awards, which is based on the feedback provided by about 2,000 in-house counsel. Similarly, Ron is listed in Chambers USA and Law Dragon and has repeatedly been mentioned in the list of the nation's 500 leading U.S. corporate employment lawyers. Lastly, he is also a fellow at the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers. So, Ron, welcome to the panel today. Want to give you a little bit of opportunity to add anything else in there.
Just excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. This is a subject I'm very passionate about, so I appreciate the opportunity to address it, and I look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks, Ron. And next we have Verity Jackson Grant, who is the global head of pricing at Simmons & Simmons, where she leads the team that works very closely with clients and colleagues at really arriving at those pricing arrangements that balance between the client needs and adding value to the firm. So as a member of the marketing and business development leadership team, Verity is heavily involved in the firm's client relationship and plays a key role in the pitching process. Verity's passions lie in creating these alternative fee arrangements outside of the hourly rate. While she does work across practice areas, her particular experience in alternative fee arrangements for dispute comes from her being previously a director of a litigation funding brokerage, an underwriter for a litigation insurance, and the head of business development for one of the world's largest dispute practices. So, Verity, welcome to the panel today. And would you like to add anything else?
Thank you for having me. Yeah, much like Ron, I'm really keen on alternative fee arrangements. I don't have the normal pricing for law firm or financial background, so this is right up my street. So thanks for having me.
Great. And then last, but of course not the least, we have John, who has worked in key account management for most of his career, starting out in financial services at Reuters in 2007, before moving over to the legal business of Thomson Reuters to establish a key account management team program focusing on big law clients. After doing a graduate diploma in law, John switched sides, joining Berwin Leighton Paisner, and finally moving to CMS about 5 years ago, where he manages the client relationships primarily in the tech and media sector. So John, in his spare time, also apparently runs a motorsport championship. So one of the more interesting panelists, I would say, that we have today. John, anything you want to add?
I'm glutton for punishment, Maui. Yeah, just to add that I've been using PERSUIT since 2019, since when I joined CMS. One of my clients was a very early adopter, and so, you know, like Ron and Verity, a big advocate of alternative fee arrangements and finding a better way of working with a client that works for both parties. So yeah, really excited to get into the conversation. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to get started and jump right in here. We do have some questions that we've already received from the audience, and we're going to start with these questions. And then, of course, we have the question and answer field available for everybody. When you field a question there, it'll come to us, and then we'll answer it as they come. We encourage you to do that. The first portion of this will be the preset questions, and then the second portion of this webinar is going to be open to the audience. We also have the webinar chat available if you want to interact with one another or field something that you want to more broadly present out to the attendees of the webinar. So we're going to get started. And really, I want to get started with a more high-level view of the industry, a more high-level view of what is currently happening, right? We've all seen the headlines. There's aggressive rate increase pressures happening to clients. There is budget constraints. Layoffs are happening on both sides, both law firms and the actual clients that we serve. So with that, there is almost an impetus to really take a deep look at how the revenue models and pricing and cost relationship between in-house counsel and their outside counsel really work and how that operates. So I want to actually ask our panelists, you know, what is happening out there right now in the law firm or legal pricing space? Are you seeing more usage of AFAs? How are clients reacting to, you know, the ever increasing hourly rate? And have you been finding the typical negotiations or conversations with your clients around cost a lot more challenging? So I'm going to direct this first to Verity, and then I would love to hear from Ron, and then finally John.
Thanks a lot. I think it's a really interesting time for law firm pricing at the moment. I think most of the big firms and some of the smaller firms now have pricing teams either within finance or within legal operations or within business development. And that's taking the onus away from the partners and the lawyers, who are, of course, still involved, but might not be so comfortable talking about money, or might have competing interests, might not have the time to deal with pricing and give it the attention that it needs. And I think that in itself is it's really great for the evolution of law firm pricing. It's leading to more consistency. It's allowing for more choice. It's stopping people defaulting to the most obvious charging rate of hourly rates. And I think that's making it much easier to manage for both clients and law firms. We've been saying the hourly rate is dying for what feels like forever. It's the slowest and most painful death that could possibly happen. But I think that clients and law firms are finally getting comfortable with alternative fee arrangements beyond the fixed fee or sort of capped fee approach that's been taken for many years. I think technology has been one of the reasons for the pain. You saw on the poll that some people say it's AFAs are painful. And in my experience, sometimes the reason they're painful is because law firm and in-house counsel sort of procurement tech or billing tech hasn't really been designed for anything other than the hourly rate. And so making that square peg fit in the round hole of, you've got your AFA, but how on earth do you invoice it or track it or bill it? That's been really painful, but I think we're seeing some solutions to that now with the new tech that's coming out. And I'm starting to see lots of clients really ask lots of detailed questions about alternative fee arrangements, and even setting targets around how much of their work is done on an AFA basis. And at Simmons, we've been really embracing that. Obviously, it's typically my preferred method of pricing, is to work closely with the clients and work out a pricing arrangement that works for both parties. And giving a choice of options, I think, is really important. So I think we're seeing much more of that in the law firm space now than we ever had. You mentioned rate increases, and I think that will become less and less important as AFAs become more prevalent. But in my experience, I think there's always, obviously, naturally, a wariness from clients when it comes to rate increases, and that tension between law firms needing a rate increase or wanting a rate increase as time goes on, and clients wanting actually to stay where they are. But I think, in my experience, if the law firm is reasonable with their request, don't make it too often, provide really clear justifications, and give the client everything they need in order to make a swift decision, then typically we can reach an agreement fairly quickly. But I think it is all how you phrase that increase and what your justifications are for it. More recently, I think there's probably has been more pushback than there was in prior months. But like I say, if you're reasonable and you put it forward and explain why you need the rate increase, then I think that's typically the best way forward.
Great. And Ron, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, we've been active with AFAs for over 20 years now, so we're well accustomed to them. I think the key is understanding the client's needs and communication about what is the right approach for a particular matter. So let me dig into both those a little bit. As you mentioned, everyone's being asked to do more with less these days, right? And that's both clients and law firms. The demand for better value at a lower price affects all of us. So the question isn't how do we stop that? The question is, how do we embrace that? How do we deliver? And that's AFAs are a big part of that. But they require communication and dialogue about the assumptions and scope of the matter or project, whatever it might be, and making sure that there's alignment on what that looks like. If we have that alignment, then the AFA part's actually easy. It's the scoping part that is the most difficult part, and that requires discussion. And they have to be tailored. There's no one size fits all. I see some requests for applying one AFA that was designed for one particular matter and applying it to a different matter. Well, that's apples and oranges. We got to talk about the scope and the assumptions that go into that. So I think I think we're all getting better at it as an industry, both law firms and clients, and recognizing that when AFAs are done well, they're great for both. It's easier from an administrative standpoint. We embrace it. It reduces our internal administrative costs significantly if we can agree on a flat fee or some other AFA. So I just think the key is communication. What's the scope? What's the staffing? What's the strategy? Because all of that's going to affect the outputs and therefore ultimately the price. But if we can agree on those elements on the front end through discussion and dialogue, then the actual AFA part should be relatively easy.
Thanks. And John?
I haven't got a whole heap to add, except, I mean, we have some clients that have moved fully onto AFAs now and don't have any hourly rates at all. So, you know, we still see a massive spectrum of clients from those who just want hourly rates to those who are obviously on full AFAs. And, you know, as Verity said, to help law firms move into that space to be able to offer AFAs, having that pricing team that can actually assess and analyze the impact of a different fee arrangement, for that matter, on the firm, gives us a bit of certainty as well. You know, it's nice that the client gets a bit of pricing certainty, but we need it as well, so that we're not going in to a casino effectively and just gambling with associates' lives. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag at the moment. Yeah, and as Verity said, I remember when I first moved over to work for a law firm, I was in a web seminar that was in person back then with Richard Susskind talking about the death of the billable hour, and he'd been talking about that for 10 years already by then, I think. And here we are still talking about it. So you know, Rome wasn't built in a day, but I think we're moving in the right direction. And the important thing to remember is that the hourly rate doesn't always work for law firms either. So there's always an option out there that works for both.
Great, thanks. And you know, I think the points that you've made really makes me want to head in a little bit of a different direction here in terms of the conversation. And that is, you know, like you mentioned, we're getting better at AFAs. Clients are now utilizing them. The tools in which we typically engage, you know, clients and law firms have also evolved. E-billing platforms, sourcing, procurement platforms like PERSUIT. And with that, I guess the next question is, you know, what do you actually think about AFAs, right? Is this a positive thing? Is this the right movement? What are some pros? What are some cons that you've seen? And most importantly, what has made it so that the AFA engagements you have with your clients work, right? How do you actually ensure that they're successful? How do you actually ensure that, you know, the management, the interaction, the setup, all of those things lead to a result that's positive for both the firm and the client? So I am going to start here with Ron, then with John, and finally Verity.
Well, let's go back to the communication theme, because I think that's the key to all of this. I like to have a discussion with the client about the factual background of a particular matter, what their priorities are, what the strategy should be for that matter, and then what their staffing desires are. And I usually give them options. With 950 lawyers, that's relatively easy to give options at different price points. So I think it's the key is that communication piece. But I have to tell you, that communication requires active engagement from the lawyer and not just the client, because I've been around long enough to know how many depositions can we expect in this case, or what is likely to come up with this opposing counsel who we've opposed 500 times before. So I can bring that level of insight to the discussion, and then we can jointly arrive at what the proverbial win-win looks like. But there has to be that dialogue back and forth.
And John, what are your thoughts on that?
Hopefully you can hear me better now. As a client relationship guy, this is the stuff that dreams are made of for us, because as Ron said, you have that communication with the client. You actually really get to deep dive into the problem. Why is it that they want to price something slightly differently? What are their concerns? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how we can find a solution that works for you, works for us. Sometimes we can't always agree. Sometimes we come back to where we started, but I think everyone always comes out of those conversations feeling like they're in a better place than when they started. And as Ron said, you know, you've got often a slight misalignment on scope. You know, perhaps the client thinks it's going to go one way and your experience says otherwise. And without that conversation, you're not going to be starting off on the right foot. You're going to be behind the curve before it's even started. And so, you know, it's really important, even if you don't end up using an AFA, let's say you go back to hourly rates, you still had a really good conversation about where that matter needs to go to get the result that you want. And it means that you have a better relationship going forward with that client as well, and with your outside counsel for the in-house team. So yeah, big fan. It's good to talk.
Thanks. And Verity.
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree with what the guys are saying. At Simmons, certainly, we really like alternative fee arrangements. Typically, once we have that conversation with the client, once we understand what their objectives are, and we're able to tailor something specific for their matter, we usually are able to come up with something that works better for both sides than an hourly rate would, and is much less of an administrational burden, as Ron mentioned, than going by the billable hour. And we're able to take that view depending on what the matter is, as to whether we base that alternative fee arrangement on sort of a cost, bottom up sort of cost of material basis, or whether we base it on the value that we're bringing to the matter, and things like that. So for us, AFAs are exciting and interesting. There is a learning curve, I think, still in some of the practice areas, just generally, not necessarily at Simmons, but at every law firm and with every client. But we try with every matter to have AFAs front of mind and to give choices. And if a client prefers the billable rate, then that's fine too. But we quite enjoy finding something a little bit different to do.
That's great. I actually, you know, that's a perfect segue into the next question that I have. I want to press in and dive a little bit deeper into that exact idea and that exact thread. So, you know, John, one of the biggest pushbacks we typically hear is that AFA just comes with an inherently high amount of risk, right? Scope changes, scope creep, disagreements, hours can just get tacked on. What are the typical ways that you try to manage that risk, and how do you communicate that to your clients? And if Verity or Ron, you have any thoughts on that as well, be open to that. But let's start with John.
Thank you, Maui. I think it's important to remember that there's a lot of inherent risk in hourly rates as well. Overruns, you know, most clients will want an estimate of what something's going to cost so that they can budget for it. And overruns happen, whatever the arrangement is. And so I think you need to move away from the mindset that an AFA is risky. I think it's risky to not do an AFA, or at least explore it, because your relationship with the client depends on it. The outcome of it depends on it. If you are managing a matter and you're not having those conversations with the client about the run rate, or how you're tracking against even a fixed fee, if you're offering that, then I think you're missing a trick. You are only going to create a little bit of tension, and no one wants the tension to be around money. You want it to be around the outcome of the matter. You want a good result for the client. The law firm wants a good result for themselves as well, because it means that the client's more likely to come back to them, and you're more likely to get a result that you want if you're having those constant communication. So if things change, if scope changes, if things pop up that you weren't expecting, you need to raise that with the other side, whether you're the client talking to the law firm about it or the law firm talking to the client. You need to raise it as soon as possible so you can have a conversation about it. Does this change anything? Does this change our strategy? Does it change how we price this matter? Does it, do we have to come up with some extra budget for this? We weren't expecting it. What should we do? And you can solve those problems together. Problem shared is a problem halved, as they always say. So, the worst thing you can do is leave it and try and sweep it under the rug and ignore it and hope it will go away, because it won't. It will always rear its ugly head and come back to bite you in the backside. So, yeah.
No, thanks.
Keep talking.
And yeah, so Ron, I actually wanted to, kind of direct this one to you from that same vein is, okay, rubber hits the road, right? The risk of the overrun actually happens. You have a fixed fee proposal. And the big concern that we hear from clients is always, my lawyers are going to stop working because now this no longer is profitable for them, no longer makes sense. AFA has that risk of potentially degrading the level of service that you get from your firms. Any thoughts on, that concept of risk that's associated with innovative pricing that can't be tied to just billing more hours, essentially?
Yeah, well, if a client has a long-term relationship with a firm, then the firm's less likely to worry about a little loss here and there on a particular matter, right? Because they're in it for the longer haul. So I think having that trusted relationship with a long-term partner, legal partner, is key. I also think that risk comes with size. The greater the greater the scope of the project, the greater the risk for both sides. So perhaps it could be broken down on the front end. And let's identify where that unknown risk is coming from for both sides. And let's carve that part out. And let's focus on the part where we have relative definition of what to expect and key in on that. And maybe that takes the form of stages. Maybe that takes the form of specific flat fees. Pardon me, lights going out. But break it down into discrete subparts that are more manageable. So I think that's another element of the scoping conversation and the communication that's needed. But yeah, sure, there's risk. There's risk in, as John said, there's risk in every business arrangement. We're not here to eliminate risk. That's unrealistic. The key is to be on the same page as to what that risk looks like. And then you can move forward hand in hand. If something truly odd comes up, I mean, truly odd, not just, the plaintiff's counsel wants to take one more deposition than we had anticipated. Okay, that's not truly odd. But if something out of the norm comes up, then most clients recognize, look, it's not fair to hold you to that flat fee because that wasn't part of our discussion. And if you have that discussion, that true discussion on the front end, it makes that conversation about exceptions much easier on the back end. But if you're not aligned on that discussion on the front end, or you're doing it in a perfunctory manner, then it makes those back end conversations more likely and more difficult.
Yeah, I just to chip in there, if I may, I think the perceived risk piece, I think it's you might not be able to get over it, but you can really mitigate that risk by using data, by modeling scenarios, by giving your firm management absolute sort of clear picture of what might happen, what the worst case scenario is, and allowing them to understand the consequences, and then see the downside and the upside and make an informed decision. So I think the risk piece, as you say, you can get around the risk piece with upfront conversations with your client and with the firm management. But I also, as to the comment, Maui, I think it was you that mentioned, was, does it affect the quality of the work? I think there are several alternative fee arrangements that promote better quality work. So if you're talking about value-based pricing, then actually the law firm might throw everything at the matter in order to come out with a better success fee, for example. Or sometimes we offer a success fee sort of structure that's based on quality of service and us meeting our SLAs. So I think it's quite defensive to think of AFAs as having a risk or affecting the quality. I think they can equally bring opportunity and improve the quality of work and improve the outcome of a matter.
Thanks. That was really, I think that's super thoughtful to hear that from a law firm, because many times what I've seen between in-house and outside counsel is there is that inherent tension, and these conversations don't happen. So I'm glad to hear from everybody on the panel, essentially, come talk to us, let's discuss it, let's agree on it, let's come to an understanding. And so that when those changes happen, when the risk eventually does pop up, it's something that we can address, and we have a process method relationship that already allows us to be able to do those things. So I think I have one more question in this area, which, I'm going to start with Verity and kind of go around in circles here. We also hear, yeah, that's great. AFAs work only for a very specific subset of matter type, commoditized, low complexity, easily definable. I would love for you to bring up, as much detail, as much as you can share, kind of one example of a really quirky AFA you've done for probably a not typical practice area or a not typical matter type. I'll start with Verity, head to John, and then maybe I'll end with Ron on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't often hear that AFAs apply to a handful of practices. I think the way that we work with them here is that we have a menu of AFAs that can work across all the different practices, and then we have some AFAs that are very highly tailored for a specific practice. And if you want one example of the sort of thing that we do here, is we do quite a lot of, if we're working as in a claimant action or a plaintiff action, for example, then we'll tailor quite specifically an arrangement, a combination arrangement that might have Simmons and Simmons acting on either a contingency fee or a conditional fee agreement, alongside a litigation funder that might be paying for some disbursements, alongside some insurance that might be behind Simmons and Simmons that hedges some of our risk, that means that we can offer more of these arrangements, and then alongside perhaps some insurance that will cover the client against their risk of having to pay the opponent's costs, for example, if the matter is in a country where costs follow the event. So we like to do some really cool things, or certainly I like to do some really cool things. It brightens my day, and I think there's general AFAs and there's very specific AFAs, but there's typically an AFA for every occasion.
Great. John, how about you? Anything that comes to mind?
Cool. Yeah, I don't think there's a single team in our firm that hasn't used an AFA at some point. So yeah, I would also agree with Verity. There's definitely a time and place for every fee structure. I mean, one of the more fun ones we have is probably an all-you-can-eat model, which, as you can imagine, for a firm our size and working across multiple countries with a lot of our clients, it gets pretty complex in the back end. But it's worth it to make it work. You have fantastic conversations with the client on an ongoing basis about what's in, what's out, how we're tracking, whether it's good value for both sides. And so, yeah, I mean, it's sometimes we win, sometimes we lose, but it's all part of that sort of longer term relationship, as Ron said earlier. You've got to be in a relationship for the long term. You can't just expect to win all the time. That's a very short-term approach, and you're not going to retain clients for a long time that way. So, yeah, I mean, we're open to anything. If anyone's got any great ideas, we'll listen to them and try and make it work. The more exciting, the better. I think one of the Q&A questions, I think was mentioning sort of how are we innovating, because AFAs are probably getting a bit long in the tooth now. Sort of the same old fixed fee, conditional fee arrangement and whatnot, but we're still finding new ways of doing things, and that's a partnership approach with our clients. It's we're doing what we can. We're sort of working within our own sort of limitations as our clients as well. But the more conversations we have about it, the better, the healthier our relationships become, and hopefully we'll see some really sort of funky things in the years to come.
And Ron?
Yeah, I think internally we give a lot of thought and discussion around what are we hearing repeatedly from clients? What are they asking for? What are they needing? And then translate that to how could we deliver that in a more efficient manner? So, for example, California recently passed a statute requiring every employer to have a workplace violence policy. All right, well, to go create a workplace violence policy is, call it 10 grand, roughly. But if every client's going to need that by virtue of the statute, why would we sit back and charge every client 10 grand for that when we can come up with, harness our collective wisdom and to Verity's point, really refine that product and come up with the best work product possible, and then essentially sell it to any interested client at a much reduced cost, call it 1,000 or $500 or whatever. We've been much more proactive on that sort of front in the last few years, and COVID had a lot to do with that, actually, because there were a lot of new needs we were hearing from clients. We need multi-jurisdictional surveys on these topics, so we would go do the survey, which on a hourly rate would cost 50 grand to create, but no one's going to pay for that because it's not worth it. But if you can deliver that same work product at $1,000 versus $50,000, that has a lot of value. So we've put a lot of emphasis internally on listening and comparing notes about what are clients needing right now repeatedly. What are different clients? Where's the commonality? And how do we deliver that in a more effective, efficient, and valuable way? The other way to go is the opposite end, which is sort of the all-you-can-eat model of we'll do it all. We'll do all your work, all your labor and employment and immigration and OSHA and employee benefits work, whatever the firm's capabilities are, for one flat fee or some sort of variation thereof. So you can either break it down into much smaller components that are easier to scope, or you can lump it all in together where a little variation here and a little variation there is relatively meaningless in the grand scheme of things. So the firms are more comfortable with that. And we've done it both ways, just depends on the client's needs and desires.
Great. So I think that leads into, the next bit that a lot of the questions also centered around that we were getting is, yes, this is great, relationship is great, and then the reality of an in-house internal team is that they have budget targets, OKRs, their sophistication has to evolve, it has to grow. And that has essentially led to this marketplace happening, right? Traditionally, it was very deeply ingrained, the relationship between in-house and their outside counsel. There were long-standing relationships that wasn't really threatened. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this piece of it, where some of this innovative pricing has come from increased competition, essentially, right? I recently read a Thomson Reuters report essentially citing the kind of downshift of work coming from the bigger law firms towards the mid-size, even, plus 200 law firms, particularly in the United States. And so clients are shopping essentially at this point, and that shopping has led to firms having to innovate and, look for what is going to get them to hit their targets financially, cost-wise, relationship-wise. What are your thoughts on this development? Do you enjoy the competition a little bit? What are the pros and cons for you when it comes to RFPs, competitive sourcing, auctions? I think it'd be super helpful for in-house teams to understand maybe some of the challenges that you face or some of the things that you like about the process to help actually smoothen that marketplace a little bit. So with this one, I'm going to start with John and then head to Ron and then finally Verity. So John.
Where to start? I feel like this is a book in itself. The increased competition isn't a bad thing, and it's not a bad thing for firms. I think it's, as with anything, you want to get to an outcome that is good for both parties, and you have to be realistic that it's not always going to be right for you. So certain matters might not be our sweet spot. We might not be structured in a way that we can offer a certain pricing structure that the client's interested in. And so, you know, the increased competition, the fact that the clients are shopping means that we're not always taking on things that we can't necessarily deliver brilliantly. And so, you know, having those sort of honest conversations is only a good thing. I mean, you mentioned auctions, Maui. I think we have a very different relationship with auctions in the UK to the US. I mean, my general approach with auctions is that we will price as if there is no auction. So from the outset, we are scoping it in a way that the price that we quote is the price that we think, or the structure that we quote for is what we think is the best thing for both of us. You might disagree, but we can have a conversation about it. So when it comes to the actual auction, rather than building in a little bit of fat to that pricing and then reducing it down to make it look like we've moved, I generally will just sit on my hands. Honestly, I would stand behind the price that we quoted originally. We might move a little bit depending on what's happening with the others, but we are not going to go into that auction having built in, say, a 10% margin that we're prepared to drop in the auction and hope that we come out reducing it less than 10%. I don't think a client is necessarily going to get the best result if everyone is going in at a higher rate than they would have done without the auction. So I know that's not necessarily what PERSUIT want to hear, but that's my take on it. But yeah, it's an interesting market at the moment. There's a lot of change, and I think everyone's got to find their feet and what works for them best. And you know, this where having a panel of firms on your roster is incredibly helpful, because everyone has different ideas about how to do things, and we can share those ideas, and hopefully together we can grow into a panel that works perfectly for the client.
Great, thanks. And Ron, what about your thoughts here?
I actually think in some ways there's less competition through law firm combinations and greater specialization. You know, I think firms are getting much more specialized on practice areas, and a lot of practice areas are being discarded from full service firms because it's not what they do, right? They're focusing on other areas, perhaps more profitable areas, perhaps areas that reflect their sweet spot better in terms of quality, staffing, whatever. So I think in some ways there's actually less competition. But I mean, I would question any law firm lawyer whose motivation is to squeeze every last dollar. That shouldn't be what's driving the relationship. My philosophy and the firm's philosophy is, if we do what we do well and take care of the client, the profit will come, the relationship will grow. So it's this. Look, I tell our lawyers this all the time. This is a service business, so you better get in that mindset. We're here to serve the clients, and that means listening and responding to what their needs are. The rest sort of takes care of itself. So when we hear clients saying we have to do more with less, we better figure out a way to do that. Is that competition, or is that being responsive to a client's needs? I tend to think of it as the latter. But either way, it's enhancing the client relationship in the long run.
Great, thanks. I really like that point. And then Verity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fine with auctions, but I'm very much along the lines of John, in that we will quote a fair price for the work that we're doing. We'll try and quote an accurate price, and we're not that likely to shift particularly in an auction. But I do also think an auction can be quite helpful. It can be quite helpful for law firms to get an understanding of where their price does sit within the market. There are some dangers, I think, or it's very important, at least for a couple of things. It's very important for that auction to have similar firms in terms of quality and experience. And sometimes you can see, or you get the impression when you see the numbers lined up, if you see the numbers lined up, that perhaps there's a mixture of quality and a mixture of experience, or alternatively, there's a mixture of assumptions. So I actually quite enjoy the auction process, but I think John's right. I think the UK approach is possibly different to the approach in the USA. But I mean, I think it works best when you've got an RFP that has either a clear scope and a really clear set of assumptions, so that you are comparing apples with apples, or where the client is taking into account, if they're not able to give a clear scope and clear assumptions, taking into account there may be differences in the assumptions. And I also think it works best where you've got and some of the PERSUIT users do this really well, that extra box that says, if you've got an alternative fee arrangement, what would it be? Because otherwise you can be stifling the possibility of alternative fee arrangements depending on how you've set up the auction. But I do think it's certainly a reasonable way to line up your RFPs on a price by price basis. I think it works really well for the low value commoditized type of work, but I think when it becomes more strategic, more nuanced, sort of higher value work, the details in how you set up the auction are really key.
Yeah, no, I agree with a lot of the points that you've made today, and I actually am not surprised to hear, you know, as way of additional background, I also came from the law firm side prior to joining PERSUIT. I was at Latham & Watkins, so I had the same thoughts. When we would enter into an auction, we understood essentially that we are providing the best price that made economical sense for the firm and what we believed would be fair to the client at the same time. I don't think any of the firms, and at PERSUIT, we don't think any of the firms should be coming in with a little bit of fat essentially on their proposals. And from the conversations that we've had similar to today, that's what we've heard. And also, we've also heard the sentiment that Ron expressed, where the firms are happy to actually be, at the very least, engaged by their client. You know, it's a proactive engagement by the client when they issue an RFP. It's them reaching out and saying, hey, we believe you are among our stable of firms, one of the ones that can potentially do this work. So show us your best showing and tell us why you're the folks for this. Because at the same time, the flip side of this that, you know, many law firms or lawyers sometimes miss is that the decision to select you as outside counsel has to be defensible for that in-house attorney. At the end of the day, they have to report that to somebody above them, or that has to make sense to the C-suite of that organization. And so that defensibility only gets bolstered by how well you're actually presenting yourself in that competition. So, you know, that's something that we've seen many firms rise to the occasion and actually welcome and enjoy and thrive when that competition happens. And so I've got one final question here from the preset before we jump into some of the extra questions. And this one, you know, John mentioned this, and it's really funny that he did, but this is the slowest death of the hourly rate. You know, slow death scenes is kind of the meme that we see, where it takes 100 seconds for somebody to actually die at the end of the day. So I want to ask our panelists before jumping into the audience questions, are you bullish, bearish, neutral on the billable hour? You know, at this point, we've been talking about it for forever, but there's a new technology, generative AI. It's the hot topic in legal, and it may potentially be the catalyst for change. So yeah, what are your thoughts? Bullish, bearish, neutral? And if you have any kind of, you know, future goggles, what do you think that future is going to look like? So with this one, I'm going to start with Ron, head to John, and then finally Verity.
We'll continue to see AFAs evolve and increase in utilization. Like I said at the beginning, I think we're all getting better at it and recognize that it requires that communication and dialogue. And we've certainly seen increases over the last 20 years in the utilization of AFAs, and I would expect that to continue. I don't think that's going to be the flip of a switch and the billable hour goes away. Probably not in my lifetime. Certainly not in my working lifetime. But But will that evolution continue? Absolutely. And I think we'll both law firms and clients will get better at it and refine it and come up with new ideas. That's the typical evolution of any good idea. I think we'll continue to see that.
Great. And John?
Yeah, I agree with Ron. I think the billable hour has a place on the menu of pricing options. I think it works well in some situations. I think it works less well in other situations. I don't think it's ever going to go away, frankly. I think there will always be a place for it. As to the extent it's used, I suspect, as Ron says, it will probably diminish over time. I don't think it will ever completely go away. But I think we need to think of it as an option rather than something that we want to get rid of. Because, as I say, it will work in some situations. Sometimes you just can't scope something. You don't know where it's going to go. But, have those conversations. If something changes down the line, if we start on billable hours, is there the option to change? Once we know a little bit more about the scope, maybe we start on it and then move to something a little bit more concrete. Having those conversations along the way are so important. So don't say bye just yet.
Great. And then Verity?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think I don't think we'll be able to kill it entirely. I think there is a place for the hourly rate. I think it's really useful at the outset of a matter whilst you're getting enough information about the matter to be able to form a view of AFAs. It's useful for out of scope work. Or as a sort of an add-on to an AFA if the matter goes beyond what everyone was thinking. But I do think there'll be continued evolution of AFAs, increased choice, and I think as AI comes more into play and as some of the legal work starts to be done by AI, I think we'll be moving more and more towards value-based pricing. So I think effectively the hourly rate will lose some market share. But there'll always be that small group of cases or law firms that operate on that basis.
And I don't speak for PERSUIT, but we might have a quorum here where I am often called the law firm sympathizer over at PERSUIT because I think that it does have its place. And I think just because it's essentially built into the pipes of law firm buildings.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. Yeah.
All their tech, all the tech has been designed around.
Yeah. Tech. Yeah. And this is actually a great lead into some of the client questions that are some of the attendee questions that have come in that I really am honing in on. So I want to ask two before we end the session today. The first one really is, we talked about identifying risks as AFA, and there's a bit of a learning curve for that. So I want to understand, oftentimes in-house attorneys rely on the expertise of the external attorney to understand what actually is entailed in the scope. You've seen this type of trial before. You know how many depositions it typically takes. You know how aggressive that counterparty is going to be. And so they typically try to lean on that outside counsel to help them develop that scope, help them develop that understanding of what will make that a good AFA. But we have had also experiences where the outside counsel also doesn't have the skills to be able to scope something well because they're used to the hourly traditional structure. What are some things that you do at your own firm that actually enables and potentially, enhances the ability of your partners and the folks that work with the in-house team to be able to help structure and scope all of those matters? I'm interested to see here if you have training programs, education, and enablement initiatives, those types of things that actually lead into using AFAs more or using AFAs better. I want to start this one with Verity and then head to John and then finally Ron.
So a couple of points. Yeah, we have training. We have a legal project management kind of foundation and set of principles, and all of our lawyers are trained in that foundation, that set of principles. They're all trained to scope a matter properly and to project manage a matter properly. So we have that in place, but we're also collecting the examples of where that's been done, so that when you have a similar matter, you can replicate to an extent. You can look at that as a base and then tweak it as necessary for this matter that you're moving forward with. Some matters, sometimes it's just not scopable. Sometimes actually we're pricing for ad hoc queries over amount of time or something like that. So sometimes actually what we're pricing is a bank of hours rather than an actual task where it's going to take this person so many hours. Sometimes you can't scope. Where you can't scope, we have some tools that help our lawyers to arrive at a price, a fixed price or a fixed set of sort of tiers of pricing, depending on whether the matter is complex or simple. And at that point, you don't price the matter until you know more about it, but you have some certainty around what it's going to cost. But yeah, all of the above. We definitely have training, but we also have specialist legal project managers, specialist pricing people that will sit and help our lawyers to scope.
Right. And John?
I think this is where something like PERSUIT really comes into its own, because if you don't know how something is going to play out, if you don't know how to scope it, you can put that onto your external counsel. So put it out to a few of your panel firms and see what they come back with. Ask them a question like, what would your strategy, what would your approach be to scoping out this problem that we have, and see what they come back with, and make sure that you give yourself the best starting point. As Verity says, some things are just impossible to scope. You just cannot even imagine what's going to happen, or it's new things happen all the time. But give yourself the best possible starting point. Give yourself a law firm to partner with that will work with you in figuring out what on earth you might want to expect, and be honest as well to the law firms. If you can't scope something, you might not be the right firm to advise. Just because you've been invited to put a proposal in doesn't mean you should. It's very important to have a go no go conversation before putting yourself forward, because you can actually harm a relationship with a client by going through everything, by saying, oh yeah, we're great at this. What if you get instructed and you're not? Be honest with yourselves as well. If it is impossible to scope, then perhaps you haven't got the right experience for that particular one.
Great. And then Ron?
I think there are three key components from a law firm's perspective. Number one, data. Having the data, like enough background on a particular project or a particular case or whatever the issue may be, such that you can provide extra value to the client by, as you were saying, Mari, educate the client on what to expect and what are fair assumptions or what's coming based on your experience as a law firm. I think that's invaluable to the client. So having the data and then being able to harness that data, and those are two different things, and you really have to have the capabilities of doing both. The second would be training, educating lawyers on how to use that data, where to get that data, but also how to scope issues, how to budget, how to track a budget, that sort of back end stuff that they don't teach you in law school. They don't teach you anything remotely close to that in law school, but is so key to a successful client relationship. So we put a lot of emphasis on that. And then third would be communication, not just with the client, which I've harped on enough, but internally, between who's ever processing invoices and the lawyers and who's ever overseeing the matter and working on the matter. And is there that dialogue so that we are tracking where we are on the matter, whether that's related to price or strategy or outcome or whatever, but who's overseeing that and tracking that and providing feedback on that to make sure nothing's going off the rails. And I think of those three components, data, training, and communication, as sort of a circular workflow where one feeds into another. This isn't a checklist where like you're done with that, move on to the next one. It's this constant reevaluation based on changing circumstances and communication. But if a firm is operating well, it's utilizing all three of those components.
Great. And with that, we just hit perfect timing. I want to thank both the panelists and all the attendees for the webinar for today. If you found things insightful, please feel free to reach back out to us. We're happy to connect folks and keep these conversations going. And also keep an eye out for the follow-on and thank you note from this webinar. You will receive a link to be able to see the PERSUIT 50. And so John, Verity, and Ron, again, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate the time, appreciate the insights, and hopefully everyone has found this a great session.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.